we're going to be recorded from this point forward for our seventh conversation in our fourth season. And we're looking at Multiplicity, which is a radically holistic approach to creating theater with Lucy Hopkins, Saskia Solomons, and the rest of us all here to discuss this together. So I'll just run by the format of the Unrehearsed Futures conversations, which is that for 45 minutes, we'll have our eminent guests' remarks recorded. And then after 45 minutes, we'll go off recording, and then we can just blather on in completely unstructured discourse.
Speak for yourself.
I'll blather on in unstructured discourse. You can make very intelligent remarks, which unfortunately won't be recorded for posterity. So, but feel free to please put all your thoughts and remarks in the chat. I'll be trying to pick up points from you on the way, and then you can feed them back in to our readers in the form of a conversation. And then we'll go on for another 45 minutes. And then we'll keep on going because it doesn't really end. The Zoom chats just keep on going until everybody leaves the room. Great, here we are. So the first thing I'd like to do is just ask Lucy and Saskia to introduce themselves. Obviously, that can be, very extensive introduction to one's own life. I mean, this could take forever, but of course, it's through the focusing lens of our discussion, our topic, which is on multiplicity. So if you could just give us a little bit of a sort of parcours of your life, what led you to this discussing multiplicity, what brings you to this moment? Do you know who would like to start? Lucy, Saskia? Take it away.
How are you feeling, Lucy? Do you want to go or do you want me to go?
Why don't you go, as this is your birth idea?
Sure. I can go. Yeah, it's a good question, multiplicity. Why am I here? So I guess I found myself in the world of theatre before I found myself, at least knowingly, in the world of multiplicity. Of course, it was always there, but I didn't know about it. So I trained at the London International School of Performing Arts with you, Amy. Really, I came to the kind of to the world of internal family systems and understanding about multiplicity through my own illness. Actually, after I graduated from LISPA, I had a period of about 5 years where I was completely incapacitated, very unwell, had all sorts of sort of physical interventions for what seemed like physical symptoms, and didn't make any improvements in my kind of health and well-being, and eventually kind of went down a different path, which led me to internal family systems and a more kind of psychosomatic, I guess you could even say psychosocial, spiritual, somatic approach, working with emotions and my own emotional traumas. And I actually did a lot of that work sort of intuitively on my own initially, and then it was my brother actually who was by that point an IFS trained therapist who I was talking to about the whole process, and he said, I think you should read this. He gave me the book on IFS at the time, and I read it and went, oh yeah, that sort of sounds a little bit like what I've been doing, but in a much more comprehensive and sort of laid out and intelligent way. So then I just sort of dived into this world of internal family systems, which is fundamentally based on this idea of multiplicity, that we are many on the inside, and that's just really felt very coherent with my experience of being an alive sort of human being, and now it's very much it's what I do in the world. I'm doing more of that in the world, but it's also, I feel it's sort of very much become my way of life. It's how I experience the world and myself and the people in it, and sometimes I tell my friends that it feels a little bit like seeing The Matrix. It's like, it all makes sense now. Who knew? Yeah, so maybe that's enough, isn't it? Is that enough? That feels like enough. Yeah.
It's absolutely wonderful. And I think, if for those who are not super clear about what you're meaning by multiplicity, we're going to get to that. So,
Yes.
so never fear. Our Lucy and Saskia are going to give us a very, grounded definition of IFS and multiplicity. Yeah, Lucy, how about you?
Thanks. Thank you, Amy and Saskia, for bringing me in on this chat. So multiplicity. So I'm a clown and a maker and a performer and a teacher. And the first show I made actually was all about, so I always used to work making characters. I find great liberation in characters, in embodying different ways, different selves. All of them felt sort of very, very real. And the first show that I made was the premise was an artist, a great artist, making a beautiful show, and her work was to present characters, and one very dramatic and another one very nervous and unsure, and another one that couldn't get a word in. And these characters, the trajectory of the show, if you like, is this artist, is the characters taking up more space than the artist was willing to give them, and this battle between, all talking to each other in this battle between these various selves of the artist, which made a lot of sense to me, which I wrote by having created these characters, trying to weave them together in a really intelligent, writerly way, and not being able to do it, but being with as a writer. But when I embodied the characters, the notion of what they might say to each other became really exciting. So that I made that show and toured it around a bit, and I always love. And then the subsequent shows I made some years later, there was always a relationship between different characters, different selves that came. So I like to transform myself inside the show. During the pandemic, when my mind fell down, as many of our minds did, I started speaking to a therapist. I'd heard of IFS via some speakers that I respected who were part of the embodiment conference, and started speaking to an IFS therapist, and it blew my mind how sort of coherent that felt, to be accepting and working with different aspects of the self. It felt like something I'd been, like you say, Saskia, something that had been intuitively sort of happening anyway. That show, I processed a lot of things in that first show, in a giving voice to those different aspects and allowing everyone to have a say, kind of thing. So that way of engaging with the self felt very comfortable, and is present in all of my work in one way or another, and also and feels really liberating and really playful and really respectful. One of the principles of IFS is a sort of deep gratitude and respect for all parts of the self, even the parts that are in conflict, even the parts that another part might find challenging in one way or another. We all know what it is to have that internal conflict with like wanting this but like judging that or whatever. So the notion of giving deep respect and gratitude for all parts of the self felt absolutely mind-blowingly liberating, as a notion, and I found that really, really helpful. So I sort of, so that's my well, a bit like Saskia, it's sort of something that was happening anyway, and then realized like, oh no, this is actually a thing, not just a thing, but really helpful, creative thing that doesn't mean I have to trawl through my life history in a sort of linear way, which feels just as I don't write with words in a line. So going through my internal story like that never felt way too complicated and sort of heavy. But engaging with different flavors of myself and seeing how they interact feels like it could be right there. It feels much more accessible. So that's me, I think, really, in terms of creative and IFS world. That's my that's me.
It's wonderful. You're referring to this sort of gateway through things not working, finding something that works for you. And so what we're interested in, and we've spoken about this between the three of us, is really looking at how theater trainings, and therapy can be very, very much fellow travelers. And of course, IFS is a therapeutic, as you're mentioning, your brother was trained in it, Saskia, is a therapeutic technique, a methodology. Do you want to give us a sense of what basically the structure of IFS theory is? What are its methods? What is it saying about human beings? I think that's really the sort of operating model is very important and interesting.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I guess I mean, as you said, IFS is a model of psychotherapy. It's an evidence-based systemic model of psychotherapy. And it's also, I think when we talk about psychotherapies, it can feel sort of quite distant and sort of academic, but it's also very much a way of understanding our human experience, and very kind of applicable to our everyday experience of being human. And it's non-pathologizing, which is something I really love about it. And it has a very it's a very kind of holistic approach. I mentioned earlier that you could even talk about it as a bio, psycho, socio, spiritual model. And I know for a lot of IFS practitioners, but also kind of clients of practitioners, IFS becomes very much a sort of a way of life, and certainly for me, it's sort of become embedded in a spiritual practice. I would say I'm notoriously bad for doing this succinctly, so I'm going to try to do that. I was having a bit of thing, but part of me yesterday was like, right, okay, let's think about how we're going to do this succinctly. So I kind of whittled it down to three foundational pillars, which I thought might be easier to understand. So the first is this idea of multiplicity, by which I mean that inside of us, we are many. There are many of us, and some people would talk about these parts of ourselves, which is a very kind of IFS lingo we talk about, and we use this language in our everyday anyway. So if you're trying to make a decision about something, for example, if you're in a bit of a dilemma, you might say, oh well, part of me feels like I should go to the party, but then part of me says, well, actually I don't really feel like it, I kind of just feel like staying at home. But then there's this other part of me that says, if I don't go, I'll get FOMO, or I'll be letting people down, or whatever. We have these, as Lucy rightly said, we have these sort of internal dialogues between different voices, and they may sound like thoughts, what we call thoughts, but it might also be, they may show up as sensations in the body, they may show up as impulses or images. These parts of us can show up in lots of different ways for different people, and there's no right or wrong way for them to show up. But yeah, the IFS kind of really, is very much kind of the opposite of the idea that of the kind of mind as monolith. There's this kind of narrative a very dominant narrative in our culture and in many psychotherapeutic models that we are one thing, and anything that breaks from that is pathologized. It means illness, the fracturing of the mind. And there, we can all think of sort of diagnosable pathologies where that, where that's sort of the diagnosis, if you like. Whereas in IFS, this us being multiple is actually a very natural and good thing. It gives us a huge amount of resource and capacity to adapt, and it's it's actually a kind of a thing to celebrate. And so these internal parts of ourselves have roles within the system, and relationships not dissimilar to the sorts of relationships that you can see in an external family, hence internal family systems. So Dick Schwartz, who kind of discovered this model, was working with clients And what he started as a family therapist, a systemic family therapist, and was very much of the kind of emerging school from the late 80s that said, oh, you know, individual therapy is dead. It's all about the family system. We don't mess around with individuals anymore. And he discovered that what he was doing actually wasn't working. So and credit to him, he got curious about what was actually happening, and then discovered this kind of world of internal parts that seemed to have, these relationships with each other. And over many, 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 many years, he discovered that these parts of us were kind of split into different types, if you like. There are parts of us that are in their sort of natural, healthy state that we could, we regard as our sort of natural personality. Then there are parts that have taken on wounds, emotional wounds, or what we call burdens, from what you might call trauma, from emotionally painful events, and these wounds might take the form of emotions, grief, fear, shame, and also some negative beliefs. I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy. I'm bad in some way. And these parts of us, the ones that carry wounds, get exiled from the system. Hence, we call them exiles in IFS, because because what they carry is too painful for the system to kind of to experience day to day. And so we have a protective system of parts whose job it is to keep those painful emotions and the parts that carry them out of our awareness. And so these protective parts might take on, and this is important, they are kind of forced out of their natural state to take on protective roles in order to keep us safe. So these protective roles may well be significant parts of who we think we are. They can take myriad forms. For example, they could be perfectionist parts. You might have a very strong inner critic part. You might have a part that makes you shy or makes you witty, or you might have a part that makes you quite aggressive or makes you, makes you fall asleep. There are all kinds of roles that these parts take on in order to keep us safe. And as Lucy said, I think something that is really fundamental to IFS that is very important is the recognition that all of these protector parts are doing their very best to keep us safe, and they have ultimately a positive intention for the system as a whole. So even if their behavior or the way they make us behave is actually very damaging to us or to people outside, aggressive parts, violent parts, or even self-harming parts, their ultimate intention for us is good. And so one of Dick Schwartz's more recent books is called No Bad Parts, which I think kind of says it quite clearly. There are no bad parts. And as Lucy said, I think that's quite a powerful shift in the way that we look at ourselves. So that was number one. Number two, now lots of different psychotherapeutic models talk about this idea of multiplicity. It's not a new idea. I should just say that. But I think, as far as I'm aware, and I'm very happy to be corrected on this, of course, as far as I'm aware, what is unique to IFS is the idea of self with a capital S, which is a bit of an unfortunate name because there are so many different ideas of what that means in different religions and different psychotherapeutic models, and it's a bit confusing. But at the same time, Dick Schwartz really wanted to honor the language of his clients rather than imposing something on them. And what they discovered was when they worked with these parts of themselves and got curious about them and listened to their stories and how they came to be to be doing what they were doing, this other sort of energy appeared. And Dick Schwartz talks about this in lots of his literature, that he noticed his clients' faces change and their breath drop down into their bodies, and they had this capacity, this sort of seemingly innate kind of inner, almost like an inner wise elder, that just intuitively knew how to be with all of these parts. And when he asked them, who's that? Which part of you is that? they would say unanimously, oh no, that's not a part of me, that's me, that's myself. And so what he discovered was that this self or self energy is this kind of, yeah, this innate, undamageable, that's really important, yeah, kind of core being of inner wisdom and powerful healing capacity. So this self at the center of our systems gets covered up by all of these protective parts, but it never goes away. It's a bit like when clouds cover the sun is still there. And in IFS, my role as a practitioner is to support a client's system and support their parts to heal, to go through a healing process, which I won't go into now because that's a longer thing, but to go through a healing process, which ultimately means that that self at the center of the system is able to become the natural leader again. It's the natural leader of the system. And it's, what that means is that the relationship between practitioner and client, if you like, is very non-hierarchical. I'm not here to kind of come and heal you with my expertise. I'm here to support you and your system to heal itself. So that's number 2, self. And then the third, which I've sort of alluded to already, is the idea of IFS being systemic. It's a systemic model, which means that we don't view individuals as sort of isolated islands. We live within many systems in our lives. We live in a family system, whatever that might look like for us. We live in perhaps an educational system or a religious system. We live in a community or a culture. We live in a nation. We live in the world. So there are these kind of, from micro to macro, these systems are not separate, and we are not separate, and you cannot make a change within one system without the others being affected. So this model of multiplicity and parts can be applied to any one of those systems. So it's a very, it's kind of goes almost beyond holistic, because it looks at all of the systems within which we exist. So I'm going to stop there because I feel like that wasn't very succinct. But it was as succinct as I could do it. And I think that's probably a reasonable outline of IFS.
That was wonderful, Saskia. Thanks. And in its depth, it was very generative, I think, of a lot of ideas and questions. So I'm sure that many people will be having, as I have had, sort of resonance with what you've been describing. I'm sure that, especially Jungians in the room, there's going to be lots of resonance with archetypal parts, and with those who have worked with systemic constellations, this sort of resonance. I think, Lucy, is it okay if we then go on to talking about how then you applied this to your work? Is there anything you wanted to add to Saskia's description of IFS and of multiplicity?
No, I really enjoyed it. It was really nice to hear it all laid out like that. We've spoken about it many times, but that was really satisfying to hear it all there together. And also I can feel how good it feels. It feels good in my body, of like, oh yeah, that feels amazing. That feels like it could be really, really helpful. It's really nice to sort of be taken through it in that way. For me at the minute, the big, well, as I said, it was sort of that the trying to get a bit of distance when inside myself to sort of hear what's going on, because it might be funny, and try to generate from that way has kind of always been a part of my practice. Because as a clown, I think you're always really working with yourself. Like someone told me one time, a comedian tells a joke, but the clown is the joke. So you've got to be able to laugh at yourself. And that is what you're doing, is sharing self with everyone to laugh at self. And then they can laugh at themselves. And in that way, there's a wonderful exchange and connection. So that's kind of always been, part of my practice, where it's really being sort of applied at the minute in my work is as I turn my practice towards community focused endeavors, you know, be that space holding, be that gathering a program of people, be that teaching, be that looking at what I might offer to a local community and what that in a relevant way, that in a really good quality way, and that sort of notion of a society, you know, the parts in a society or the parts in any given community, and becomes really relevant, especially with this notion of benevolence, and inclusivity, you know. I'm part of a team that runs a festival up in Scotland, which the festival's called Vogry Pogry. We bill it as a festival of free family festival of creativity and curious happenings. And we have a sort of an approach of radical inclusivity to that festival. Like, how do we include everyone in a way that is actually, how do we actually include everyone? What needs to happen? What needs to be in place for people to feel peaceful to be there? And it feels like that's very much parts work in a way. That's very much how does everyone come together? What's required for people, for all of those different strands of society to be able to engage? What need and the with inclusivity, that's what I really got from IFS. It's like radically inclusive. All parts are welcome. All of you can. It's not even that they're welcome. They're all here, and they all have inherent value. And I think sort of looking at society, for example, looking at humanity in that way, feels deeply healthful, and something that it is not happening at large. You know, there's so many stories about who shouldn't be allowed in, or who is bad, or who has actually, you know, in loads of different directions. I have my own. I'm like, those lot though, I think they're bad. You know, I mean, we all have that sort of the folk or the ways of being that we don't want in. But so those hearing you speak, Saskia, it really occurred to me how much that how IFS is guides my wider sort of community practice and how I want to show up in the world. How being big enough to hold the opposing parts, the different agendas. How do we do that work without allowing harmful ways of being, you know, like, but how do we accept, you know, like radical acceptance kind of thing. And it's really, really hard. Is what I've come to realize. Is extremely difficult actually including everyone. You know, the presence of one lot means that those lot can't really exist. So how do you, okay, you know, it's extremely difficult. That's been it's been a fascinating journey to try to do. So that's I don't know, did I answer your question? That's how I see it, and applying to my work in a new way since having engaged with it as therapy, very, very much so.
Yeah, I mean, that's so powerful to link holism with an idea of acceptance, that to be holistic, one has to really accept everyone and everything that is in the space. So you know, we're in this really interesting, sensitive sort of part of our this topic, which is where the practice obviously is healing for the person who's creating using IFS, but how would you say that manifests in terms of the interaction with the audience? I mean, how could then the work of theater that's generated have that same effect for the audience? Can you speak a little bit to that? I mean, are you proposing a sort of different type of theater, a different type of audience interaction? Where does that healing, what does that healing theater look like when it greets the audience?
Yeah, I mean, definitely starting from a position of radical acceptance, 100%. So the audience, it's like, there they definitely are as they are, and that's totally fine. They don't have to do anything. They don't have to laugh. They don't have to, they can do what they want. It's up to them. There's no sort of sense of controlling. There's a sense of inviting, and there's a sense of engaging, and there's a sense of allowing that engagement to happen in the room and encouraging it to happen, and also the like just paying attention to them. If we as the performer, you know, attention, we get attention by giving attention. If we give our attention to the audience, then the audience will return it, kind of thing. You know, when people, you know, I mean, we don't need to try to get people's attention by being amazing. It's, you know, you will, but if you actually give your attention, then people come in, you know. So I think definitely like that, and that's felt if I deeply allow, many in the way that I approach work. I've heard many times people say like, oh, you totally control the audience, and it's not really true at all, I think, but I do totally allow them, you know, and I feel very sure that whatever they do will be a contribution, definitely, because it will, you know, and that's up to me to make it into one, you know. Whatever happens, then it's a gift, you know. It's like, I spent a bit of time in Georgia, in near Russia, that Georgia, and there the guest is a absolute gift from God. Any guest is a gift from God, and it's a sort of, maybe I took a little bit that with the audience. Anything that they do, it's a gift, it's a contribution, it's a sign of their presence, and it's reality. It's just reality. If somebody does something, or that it's really happening, so then if I can engage with it, then we all go, oh my God, we're all in the room, and straight away it feels magic and alive, because we're all really there, you know. So I think that and the audience is, after, actually what happens is I tend to be the one holding the benevolence rather than controlling the audience, because the audience becomes extremely sort of quite harshly self-policing. If someone goes da, 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 and I respond, and then they come with a second thing, or oh my God, a third, the audience are like, you know, the other people in the audience start to get more aggravated than I do at the interjections of the you know. So my role is often to be holding benevolent, allowing space, and reflecting back to the people who are provoked, that maybe, that, you know, like why that might be happening for them, you know. So an audience like the self, like the whole constellation of the self, if you like, the audience will fight itself if not soothed actively, you know. So that's how I see that happens, is by allowing, and then, you know, then all sorts of silly things happen. People are so silly.
It sounds quite simply that you're conjuring up an image of a very participatory type of show.
Yeah,
that's clearly part of the IFS generated theater, is very participatory. It sounds like the artist is, in a sense, a facilitator. Is this the same between the two for both of you? I mean, do you find that, Saskia, that you also have created, you know, this sort of highly participatory type of theater where you're facilitating? It sounds like what you're describing, Lucy, is you're sort of facilitating the audience's process. Would this be characteristic of the kind of theater that gets produced from this understanding of multiplicity?
I mean, it's a great question. I guess I don't feel I can talk about kind of theatre in general, but I can speak about my own experience. I made so I guess after the pandemic, during which I was training in IFS, the sort of synthesis between this new modality and my previous theatre training started to sort of creep towards each other, and I've been exploring this process. How does really welcoming, being with all these parts of me. What happens when they're fully invited into this process? And I created a show called Fool's Gold, which was at Edinburgh Fringe this year, which was very participatory because of the nature of the theme. It was very much it was a bit of a Frankenstein, to be honest, of different forms. But one of those forms was a sort of almost discursive space. It kind of was really inviting the audience to actually, talk to each other. So in that sense, yes, it was very participatory. And I'm really loving hearing Lucy talk about Lucy, you talking about your experience in that and that kind of radical acceptance of what's in the room. Personally, for me, I don't think it has to be kind of obviously participatory. I think you could certainly do a piece with a fourth wall and it still be very much informed by what you're holding for an audience, because of course if you have a fourth wall, it's not really there, and you're still humans in a space resonating together. We osmose because we're not, we don't have cement around us. So my feeling is that when we come on stage with all of our parts welcomed, and all of the parts of ourselves who don't want to be there welcomed as well. Before my show in Edinburgh every day, I did a little process where I would kind of go inside, close my eyes, go into kind of internal space, talk with my parts, which is a practice I do daily, and ask them who wants to be on stage and who doesn't. Because they don't all want to be on there. Some of them they want to go into something else. So and I did a little process where I would help them to, one of them wanted to go and eat ice cream on a bus, someone else wanted to go and sit on a bench. Some of them wanted to be there but didn't want to be seen, so they could sit in the audience. So I had a little gang of parts at the front going woo, and maybe some of them wanted to be on stage but wanted to hold my hand. So there's a way that I'm exploring of coming into the creative process, but also coming on stage from what I call a place of internal consent, so that I'm not battling with any parts of myself to be there, which means that self-energy that I talked about is very present and kind of, if you want, is driving me on stage. And of course all those parts are kind of, my performative part, my communicative part, all of those playful performer parts are there. But there's this sense that I'm coming on stage from a place of curiosity and kind of a natural presence and compassion for everything that's going on in the room. And audiences' parts feel that. And it's very permissive. And in IFS, we talk about the way that parts invite parts, because they kind of, there's this sort of distancing thing that happens if they're kind of in that protector role. But that self energy attracts self energy, so it's kind of snowballs, and there's this, and that's when I think what you were describing, Lucy, kind of this sort of kind of magical sense of complicity in the room between a performer and an audience, and this sense that anything can happen, and there's a real kind of electric sort of presence that we are co-creating. I don't know, but my sense is that some of that self-energy is around, and there's this sort of and that is in itself quite healing for us, because if our self-energy is covered up by a lot of protection, it can feel quite new for some of our parts. They can go, oh, what's this? That feels nice. Oh, I'm being met with curiosity and kind of, compassion and creativity and confidence and all these things. So I don't think it has to be interactive, but I think it is inherently interactive because that's all going on anyway, even if the form isn't interactive, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense.
Well, I mean, I think you know, from the very vivid descriptions you both have given of your work and the values that you hold, also, I can imagine what is not like that. But it might be interesting in this sort of final phase of the recorded conversation to tease out a little bit the sort of, there's definitely a promissory quality to what you're describing. So the world could look different. Yeah, so theater training could look different. The theaters that we attend could look different. But there's also a critique inherent in having looked for the promissory qualities that you found. And I'm just wondering if you're, you know, interested in teasing out a little bit what you think this holds for theater practices and theater practitioners, and also in a sense what you think it would be redressing. What is it, you know, addressing? What is it redressing by bringing this radically holistic approach to creative theater practice?
Okay, here we go. Let's transform the world, friends. Ready? Buckle in. Yeah, I think it's like massive. There's loads of work to do, right? That's like such an understatement, isn't it? If you look, so I think for me, there's something about all therapeutic and arts practices, potentially what can happen when they invigorate, when they connect to our deep self, the energetic. So I'll talk about it in the energetic quality of practices, of ways of being, and what happens when those energetic practices are aligned with something that is nourishing and healing, for want of a better word, healing. And by that I mean restorative to the human and the wider world, you know, and the non-human, the earth, the life force, healing to life force, right? And allowing of life force, and respecting the edges of one's own life force goes as far as someone else's does, you know, so in order for cohabitation, you know, right, in the big wide vision of, wouldn't it be amazing if we all can live really nicely together, that sort of spirit of it, right? Anyone doing any sort of practice with those values is bringing forth a sort of a vibration that allows it to be possible. You know, this world is run so through with injustices of all kind, and historical injustices of all kind that are still manifest all the time, and this notion of like, that's just the way it is, and this all the challenges that come with those injustices being raised to the light, and what that makes what that makes people feel from all the different parts, and the massive complexity of trying to unpick those injustices with the brain, because no way, and the massive resistance to power holders to release those injustices and actually allow a rebalancing. You know, I mean, we're sort of up against it, right? That being said, I really believe, and that bringing forth a vibration that allows for healing of the self and others in whatever form, in a chat, in a making of a meal or a cup of tea, in a theatre show, in a workshop, and wherever you can, is profoundly transformative. And I think there are people doing that work all over the planet in so many ways, you know, and it's almost like we drop in and drop out, you know, it's like a choir holding a note kind of thing. Like sometimes you can do it and sometimes you're like, I hate this, you know, what, you can't, you know, whatever. But you know, it's not one of us, you know, like there's lots of people trying blindly and badly to do that, you know. So I think for me, the way that I approach it in a way that doesn't feel completely overwhelming, that's the way that I approach it, in a way that doesn't feel completely overwhelming, but aligns me with the sense of trying to do something that could be amazing. I'm a real life is amazing. Life force, like this planet is a miracle. You know, it's amazing what we get to live. So trying to line up with that and allow that to be simply with all its flaws and all the impossibility of being it, you know, all of that sort of thing, then for me that's where that's where it can be deeply transformative, I think, you know, like the humility of well, that's like a therapy session, like just the acceptance, going, maybe everyone's doing a really amazing job. That as a notion, like, everyone's doing a really amazing job, oh my god, you know, like that as a notion. Yeah, so I don't know, I say that without dropping down into the detail of the massive complexity of all of our personal work, you know, because we're inheriting loads from all of the lines of ancestry, because DNA, you know, I mean, it's massive, the job, but aligning with that as a notion and a sort of vibration and a possibility, and recognizing that that's happening all over the planet in loads of different ways and flavors, feels like something I can engage in, you know, because it starts in the body. It feels like, okay, I can try to do that. It starts in the body and goes, and then, like Saskia was saying, self-energy attracts self-energy, and, you know, vibration of sort of understanding and compassion feels better. Feels like more things are possible, you know, like that, really starting from a simple practice in that way. And I think if that's run through, I mean, basically, friends, if that's run through like every single human and all sort of, you know, practices, institutions, everything, then, you know, problem solved, basically. So that's what I think. That's
yeah. Yeah, wonderful. What would you like to add and to that, Saskia? What do you?
Wow, yeah, it's thank you, Lucy. Yeah, it's really really resonating a lot with what you're talking about, and I can notice a part of me like, what was the question?
I think it was, how do we resolve, how do we fix the,
how do we save the world? Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, I think sorry to interrupt, Saskia. I think that Lucy gave such a visionary sense of what this promissory quality to your work is. And as we were discussing, there was also there was a critique of some of the more destructive. So there's a sort of a plus and a minus.
Yeah.
You obviously responded to something with this development in your practice.
Yeah. It's interesting. I noticed a part that's like, I have to be critical. Oh no. But I'm going to be. Yeah. So I yeah, I again, I'll speak from my own experience. I've noticed in not just in theatre training, and I say theatre trainings like they're all the same. The theatre, some of the theatre trainings that I have experienced. There we go. And not just theatre trainings, but also in kind of meditation spaces or yoga spaces or other sort of embodied spaces. I've noticed a kind of reaffirming of the mind-body split polarity. And I'll explain a little bit what I mean. At least my experience of our dominant cultural narrative is still that the mind and body are separate, and because my experience of the culture that I live in is kind of head first, logic first, thinking first, rational first, and kind of body, intuition, kind of flow state, the unknown, sort of imaginary liminal spaces, not so good. And I've noticed that in those other spaces, some theatre spaces, some kind of embodiment practice spaces, the same kind of dichotomy is reinforced, but just from the other angle. So it's like, get out of your head, stop thinking, get in your body. Those kinds of, I hear those phrases a lot. And for me, I noticed in those theatres, those kind of theatre training spaces, that all of my kind of thinking rational parts felt sort of attacked or shamed, or kind of like they were like, no, you're wrong, and we want the other ones. And actually, my understanding is that very much contributed to what became my illness afterwards, that I felt that in order to be in those spaces, I had to exile parts of myself in order to attempt to do what I was being asked to do by the teacher. My kind of good student parts were very strong, and they wanted to get it right and do what they were told, and all of those things, because I've been educated in an education model that's what succeeding looks like. So over time, and working with this kind of intuitive process, and combined with then what became internal family systems for me in my life, it's about sort of, well, kind of undoing all of that, and re-welcoming everybody and validating everybody, the intuition, the playfulness, the thinking, rational, all of them, because they're all in here, they're all together. And so when I talk about this idea of being radically holistic, it's sort of defiantly holistic. There's a sense of, in me anyway, this sort of like, no, I'm not gonna do that. I'm gonna really love and welcome all of the parts of me, even when they don't agree, which they inevitably won't. And that feels like something which has not only been deeply transformative and powerful in my own life, but also in my own creative practice, which is still very much a process. I certainly don't have all the answers at all. I'm exploring this. And I hope, and I'm excited about how that kind of radical, holistic way of being with myself and others means that I can offer that. I can offer that in the world, in theatre spaces and beyond. And my hope is that we're kind of like mycelium, and it's not just, I'm not arrogant enough to think that I'm the only person doing this. There's lots of people doing their own version of this in miraculous and brilliant ways, and I'm sort of hoping that we're sort of going to osmose and be like mushrooms, and the systems that I was talking about earlier, this idea that we aren't little islands. It can feel like that, but we're not. In the same way that I believe we live in a largely traumatized and traumatizing culture, then our theatre industry is traumatized and traumatizing. Therefore, our theatre trainings have to be traumatized or are traumatized and traumatizing. I'm being very general here, I realize this, but just for the sake of clarity, because there's a sort of sense for me that some theatre trainings kind of like, well, if you can survive this, you might have a chance in the industry. But I always thought, well, I don't know if I want to be in that industry, because it looks horrible. it's traumatizing, and I have to negate all these sides of myself in order to be in it. So I guess there's a curiosity for me about perhaps if what kind of facilitators or collaborators or artists might be offering themselves and others this curiosity and compassion for all of what we are, and this radical welcoming of all of what we are in training spaces might seep into the industry and out into the world, and might then affect the bigger systems. So there's kind of, I'm one little person, so I'm doing what I can, but and I'm sure there are other people doing, as I said, fabulous work in the ways that they can. But I think that for me, that systemic element of this work feels hopeful and inspiring to me, because I think if you kind of feel yourself as, I'm just this little person and the world is in a terrible there, then it's challenging. It's really challenging. So I guess my hope is that on that kind of energetic level that you were talking about, Lucy, there's this and the fact that we're even here having this conversation to me means that's happening, and that's really exciting.
Well, this is wonderful and very, very rich, and we're definitely at the boundary of our recorded conversation. Like I said, this how long is a piece of string? We really have, we can discuss at length. But in terms of the recorded bit, I think one of the things that we're doing with Unrehearsed Futures is creating an archive of if not visionary, salubrious theater practices, the methodologies that are good for the world. And so at this point, it would be really great if anybody else really would like to contribute something to this record, because it is recorded, that you can go off mic and just put in some let's say knowledge for the recording before we really go into a conversation. We've had some really interesting remarks already in the chat, so we'll turn into a conversational mode after this point. But would anybody like to say something? Is anybody moved to really sort of add something to the record at this point? Feel free to raise your hand or just unmute yourself. Just looking through the pages of us. Okay, well, that's I'm sure that there's some very
there's a Michelle waving. Contribute.
Hello, thank you all of you for this. It's wonderful. It's very comes at a very good moment, and I think that it comes at a good moment for me personally. But I think also, like as Saskia said, there's a reason why all this stuff comes together at certain junctures in time, and it feels very necessary to radically think about ways of opening up. To me, as someone who teaches and performs, like how do we open up our thinking about what radical acceptance is as well? Like sometimes I get very frustrated. I'm like, why is this group of people not as diverse? Why? And then sort of dealing with the reality of like where you are in time and space, and then be able to kind of get into a state of radical acceptance with all of the people within the people that are in the room. So I think that my response or my thought would be just I think it's a really great invitation to deal with what's there, with reality, and to be in a state of play and kindness and compassion with that reality, and then the incredible multifarious possibilities that open up from that, rather than being frustrated that it's not something you expect. So thank you.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, Michelle. And Jehan, you seemed to be very bringing in a bit about the parts of mind and body that seemed to be activating.
Amy, can I just quickly respond to Michelle? And it wasn't really. Is that okay? Just briefly.
Yeah, sure.
Michelle, thank you. And I think for me, like the kind of the linchpin, I suppose, of all of this practice is curiosity. I think that for me is like the fundamental, because I think there are two types of curiosity. I think there's the kind of curiosity which isn't really curiosity. It's kind of like, I want to understand this so I can fix it and make it go away. Which we might think of as being kind of, I want to, that kind of curiosity. But I think if we're able to be with if we're able to kind of meet groups that we're working with, or meet the world, or meet ourselves, or any kind of practice from a place of true open curiosity, then everything feels really possible to me. In the same way that a child will kind of pick up a rock and go, oh, there's a centipede under there, or there's a oh, that one's got a snail. If we can have that same sort of attitude to our own experience and to the experience of working with others, then I think for me, there's everything kind of follows from that. And if we can't be curious, if we're noticing that I feel frustrated or I feel kind of stuck or limited, then to get curious about what is stopping me from being curious, if that makes sense. There's a really great quote from Frank Anderson, who's a lead IFS trainer, brilliant guy. And he says, which I think is beautiful, if it's in the way, it is the way. And I think that's a really helpful, kind of reminder to be like, oh, okay, let's get curious about the thing that's stopping me from being curious about this. Yeah, anyway, I'll let you carry on.
That's wonderful. Thank you both for teasing that out. Yeah.
Can I add something, Amy? I wanted to add something about sort of care, basically systems of care and support systems. And I'm wondering, Jehan, looking at your question there in the chat, if I think this might speak to this as well, perhaps. But basically, when we're talking about radical acceptance, right, and putting ourselves in a vulnerable state of allowing interaction, I think something that I found in a teaching practice, certainly, it's at one, like, it's all very well encouraging performers to hold space and strengthening them so that they're powerful enough in themselves to manage the interaction of an audience. But in the systems of society where some people are encountering an imbalance of power, and are carrying more, are dealing with heavier stuff, having in place systems of care. By that I mean, it's that, see, even saying systems of care sounds like, oh, some people need care. It doesn't even have enough respect inherent in the term in my mind, which I think is a part of the problem. I'll try to give a more solid example of, I work a lot with young queer people, for example. And as much as I can encourage those young queer people to stand in their power and show themselves and be in their vulnerability, which is at the essence of clown training, I would not send those people alone into a comedy club full of predominantly white, straight guys, or certainly heteronormative, and so, go on, you can do it. It's not, that isn't going to work. What's important is the constellation around, so that person and those people can go, look at us, look at this, that there's support for these transformations. Yeah. And I think there's something about the I just want to recognize that. I think that's really important. And in training, in order to do this work, we need to have all sorts of supports in place. I wouldn't train up a person of color in clown, in vulnerability, to go out into a white audience and go, no, go on, go and be laughed at, because how do we know what that laughter is? The audiences need educating as well as the performers, and for that to happen, it's about doing it in a way that makes the space safe. Impossible concept. Makes the space ripe for interaction to happen, allows a different way of engaging and seeing. So I just feel it's important to say that in terms of these transformations happen as a many, as a collective. It's not just, we've kind of talked about us doing our work and then going out into the world. It's like doing our work and going out into the world, connected with people doing that work, so you can have some vulnerability and know that when you look either side, you've got some people going like, yeah, we totally got you, and some people with skills to close down something that might be difficult to manage, or support the person to engage with that, whatever, and I think I felt, excuse me, Jehan, I'm just gonna go back about, because it feels connected to this thing of the transformation, rebalancing of power coming at the expense of one element losing power, rebalancing of the mind, rebalancing of the mind body coming at the expense of that losing. And I think it's yeah. If you don't want to let go of it, yeah, absolutely. It does. So with the mind, if there's a part of the mind going, I have to be in control, then yeah, that is to be worked with to to soften that. Look, now I'm here. Felt like it was going smoothly to a sort of like everything. I was going to respond to this question and say the thing. I can't bring it together. The thing that I really wanted to say was how important it is to not expect to encounter challenging outsides by oneself without solid care and community in terms of for our well-being. I think that's what happens in theatre education. Toughen up, front it out, get good, deliver. But actually we're way more powerful recognizing that it's like our vulnerability happens in connection with support systems and networks. And I think in that sense, if you feel part of a network, it's also easier to soften one's hold on power because you change your whole paradigm. It feels so good to be in community when you accept that you can be and be seen, then power gets loose. So the mind doesn't need to control because it's safe, because it's supported. So I just wanted to really emphasize the importance of any of us confronting this work or doing anything. The radical importance of network, of community, of people with you, holding space with you. It's imperative. It's the thing that we say, no, just you do it. If you can't do it, maybe you're not up to the job. It's a pressure given that I think is wholly inappropriate and unrealistic. So
well, Jehan, would you like to respond? Your remarks in the chat have been mentioned. So do you want to speak to that?
No, I mean, the remarks were literally remarks and not questions per se, because of what I was hearing and how that got me thinking further.
Yeah.
But if we bring it back to Lucy's save the world bit, which is what I wake up, my ears will always perk up anytime anyone says, how are we going to save the world? I'll be there with you right there. And I find myself just wondering about, I'm just, the big question I've been asking is how do we get more and more people into a space of radical self-awareness and radical acceptance and networking and all of these things, which I think are, and I'm not trying to say this looking down my nose at those who have not started on this journey, but they feel like we are working or we're attempting to work at a higher order of consciousness rather than at a base level of consciousness. And it's the idea of stepping out of the day-to-day rat race, rigmarole, all of that stuff that allows us to do this. But self-awareness is crippling. I mean, when you're suddenly aware, you suddenly realize you've got so much. I mean, look at the family model here that you guys have put up. I mean, like that's everybody in my head already. And like, that's the kindergarten classroom. And now if I'm stuck in there, how am I going to go and save the world if I'm trying to manage my own kindergarten inside my head? And this thing that it just seems to be so much more efficient and so much more easy to be, and now I'm really talking about saving the world in terms of like a social consciousness, a planetary sort of awareness, and groups of people and larger communities of people and networks of people, all the way from like a local community to a planet-wide Gaia-esque community. Sorry, forgive me and indulge me for a second. But fascists and dictators and monotheic and monolithic thinking and othering and us versus them and all of those paradigms just are so ridiculously efficient at mobilizing us. And here we are saying that we have to do all of this stuff in order to inoculate against that kind of mobilization, in order to, and I do think that theater and theater methodologies have in them the vaccine factory that allows us to maybe inoculate against what I call these as pandemics of thought and imagination and ideology. But I just don't know if it's so easy to get infected by a virus, then how the hell do we make it as easy, or how do we step up to a whole higher order level of work? Because if self-awareness is so crippling and then you're suddenly stuck with all of the hard work you have to do at that level, then how is that ever going to be able to like build in a way that acts as a counterpoint so that you don't have the former and you can only work at the latter? How, like, I'm thinking of Julius Caesar's mob, I'm thinking of friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I'm thinking of all of that. I'm just thinking about how easy that mob was to turn in one direction and another. And imagine if that mob was a whole bunch of people who were very smart, sharp, self-aware, done all the inner child work, done all of that stuff. I wonder how they would have spoken back to both Mark Antony and Brutus at that moment in time. But how do we get to a condition where that's actually what's going on?
But it's a whole different flavor of being. There wouldn't be a mob. If those people were doing that, they would no longer be a mob. It would be people, you know, I think it's really.
So how do we get 8.5 billion people to discover what?
No, you just do you. You do you do your friends, you do your loved ones, you do the ones around you. Just do you. Otherwise, what? You're trying to be king of the world. You know, it's like then you're in the paradigm. You can't force everyone to self-realize. You can just flow your attention to the thing that you believe in, and never underestimate the power of vibes. You know, it's like if we think like that, before you know it, you're in that dictator model. It's like what you're saying, how can I do this work when I've got all this kindergarten? You're taking care of that kindergarten is the work. You're flowing your sweet attention to all of those kids to go, it's all right, you can be how you are, and I love your playfulness, and whatever it is that work is, that is the work. And if you're talking about higher level of consciousness, then let's have faith in interdimensionality and the absolute power of vibration and connection. And it's like just do it. Don't get distracted by also don't get distracted by how bad the bad that is definitely happening. But energy feeds energy. It's like you've got to flow your attention to the simple, whatever you can, where it can take seed. You know, it's like that thing that, you know, there's a very well-known thing about the Titanic. The Titanic's going down, and there's a group of people that are in total denial, that are saying like nothing's happening at all. There's a group of people that are actively trying to survive, and there's a group of people that have no idea what is happening, but they want to, but they don't know how. Those people, like just and also accept the passage of time. Accept the passage of time and the massive, fantastic, rich history of the world and the rise and fall of civilizations, and just participate in life like a living being, as aligned with your values as you can. You know, I mean, we just got to and accept how absolutely flawed we all are, and let that be part of it. You know, I mean, I think it sounds, well, the great pleasure of being a clown is you can say ridiculous things, completely stand behind them. You know, it's like it enables me to like massive dream, you know. But I think like that we're trying to, if we're trying to resolve things on the outside, it's way too big, it's overwhelming, and then we'll stop. If you go, how are my work relationships? How is the organization in which I work? Is it equitable? Are people being paid fairly? Do people feel raised up and like they've got voice in an equal and a sustainable way? What can I do to improve that? Just improve it there. That's like, okay, guys, so that's that sorted.
This is wonderful. We've been an absolutely marvelously disciplined Zoom kindergarten, and now we are actually at the frontier of our official session. So we're gonna not only stop recording, we're gonna say thank you to everybody, and hope to see you also at our next meeting, which will be on the 14th of December with Mgeni Machali, I believe, if I'm not incorrect in saying that. That's our next conversation. But and thank you so much to my wonderful guests.
That is indeed right.
Saskia, it's incredible. Incredible, illuminating and provocative conversation. We're not going to stop. We're just going to